Hello, welcome back to the Lion's Den. This video is going to be an introduction to a new series that I'm doing, the Much Ado series, where I talk about things that are, quite frankly, rather trivial and unimportant to discourse in some particular topic, but are nevertheless blown out of proportion or made to seem like they're important to that discussion. And as I'm sure you've probably been capable of deducing from the title of this video, today is Much Ado about Naturalism of the Gaps. Now, I've been wanting to do a video on this for a while, and I figured now would be the good time. The reason that I'm talking about this is because a lot of creationists, pretty much exclusively creationists, will posit that if we don't understand something, but you assume that the explanation for it will be natural, that's fallacious. You're inserting naturalism into that gap. There are a couple of reasons why that's wrong. The first one is that naturalism or materialism, because it's oftentimes worded as materialism of the gaps, are philosophical ideologies. They're not themselves explanations. You can have explanations that align with those ideologies, but it's not that somebody is inserting the ideology into that gap. What's really happening is that, and this would be the second reason why this is not a fallacy at all, and it's not a reasonable objection. What's really happening here is we are going off of the implicit empirical basis, as somebody that I admire, T-Jump, often says. I love that phrase. We're going off of the implicit empirical basis for the explanations that we have, and they're exclusively natural. They fit within the natural world, and they're scientific. So what we are doing is we're stating, hey, everything else that we have ever explained, we've explained through natural means, natural mechanisms that can be explained scientifically and mathematically. We don't know what this is, but when we get an explanation, it is most likely that this explanation will be natural, it will fit within the natural world, it will be a naturalistic explanation that can be quantified through scientific methodologies. That is called an inference to the best explanation. That is exactly what is being done here. What these creationists are trying to do is put the inference to a natural explanation on the same fallacious foothold that God of the Gaps is, because almost everybody, theist or atheist, what have you, acknowledges that such a thing is fallacious. You are stating, we don't know, therefore we know it's God. And that is a God of the gaps. You're just taking a gap in scientific knowledge and inserting something that has no precedent, that has no implicit empirical basis into that gap as an explanation where it doesn't really fit. Another problem with doing this is that God isn't an explanation. Even if God were to exist, it still wouldn't be an explanation. The main reason for this is because God is non-natural. He's separate from the natural world. Now, despite the fact that he may be able to interact with it, he is still separate from it. What this means is that we don't have a mechanism for how God, or how anything non-natural or supernatural, if you prefer that term, interfaces or interacts with the natural world to produce any particular effects within it. Well, that is one of the things that an explanation needs. That's part of what an explanation is, a mechanistic description of how something occurs within some particular framework. A good example would be electromagnetism is an explanation of how numerous phenomena in our reality take place, and it has a physical description of exactly, in a mechanistic sense, these things take place. Now, I'm not going to dive into that. Anybody who's interested can go look at classical electromagnetism or quantum electrodynamics to get the minutiae of the details of how that works. But it is physical, and it can be quantified mathematically. Non-natural explanations can't. And that's why asserting, well, you're just doing naturalism or materialism of the gaps isn't a sound objection, and it isn't fallacious to do that. Because number one, we're working from a well-established precedent. The only explanations we've ever had for anything, ever, have been natural and have been within scientific methodologies, have been developed within the framework of scientific methodologies. At the same time, we're talking about something that happens within the natural world, under natural laws, presumably, and on natural material, presumably matter and energy. So if there is something affecting it, the best assumption that could be made is that the mechanism here is natural. There's never been a non-natural explanation given for some observed phenomena in reality. There hasn't been. I will give you 5 seconds to think of one. I'm sure nothing came to mind, or at least nothing that can be reproduced in a lab and experimentally verified. And again, this goes back to the fact that, well, non-natural explanations aren't really explanations at all. They're more assertions that this thing did this with no way of mechanistically describing how, and no way to test for that in a laboratory, and not really a way to pull any novel testable predictions out of that. This is why science does not assume non-natural things when it seeks to explain something. Because they're not really explanations, at least not in any meaningful sense. However, we do have an established precedent, as I said before, for natural explanations. Lightning was once thought to be supernatural, as was thunder, as was the sun rising. We all know now that there's nothing supernatural involved with those. We have established scientific explanations for these that fit well within a natural framework. That's the precedent. We've only ever explained things within the framework of the natural world. That does not imply that the natural world has to be all that exists. So saying naturalism of the gaps is wrong, as I said earlier in the beginning of this video, for that reason, because it's assuming a whole ideology is being inserted into this gap when that's not what's happening. Actually, nothing is being inserted into this gap. What's being done here is a reasonable inference being made that every explanation that's ever been provided for any phenomenon that we have ever observed has been within the framework of the natural world and has been quantified mathematically through scientific methodologies. We would expect that anything that we don't yet have an explanation for, if it occurs within the natural world, would likely have an explanation that fits within the natural world and can be quantified mathematically through scientific methodologies. Again, to reiterate, this is an inference to the best explanation. That isn't fallacious. And for me, it gets a little tiring having to explain this, because inferring that because this is what we've utilized to explain things in the past, and it's the only thing that's provided verifiable explanations, so we're going to use that to infer that this will be explained through the same methods, is somehow fallacious. It just gets tiring. That isn't in any way, shape, or form fallacious. If I had a bag with a number of marbles in it, and we started pulling out marbles by the handful, the only color of marble that we've pulled out is a blue marble. Is it reasonable to assume that the next marble that's pulled out is blue? Yes. Is anybody saying that the next marble has to be blue? No. But I think everybody would acknowledge, if you've got a big bag of marbles, and you've pulled out several hundred of them, they've all been blue, that it would be reasonable to assume the next marble will also be blue. Now, if somebody asserts that it has to be, that I would argue is fallacious. That would be the black swan fallacy, I believe. That because we've never seen a marble that's not blue, therefore they don't exist. That would actually be more the blue marble fallacy, but within the context of that particular conditional hypothetical. But it is reasonable to assume the next marble will be blue. Even though we don't know for certain that it will be, because all the other ones have only ever been blue, it is reasonable to assume the next one would be blue. Now, it might be the case that the next marble is the first marble that's not blue. And now we have some, albeit not as established as the blue marbles, but we still have some precedent for another color of marble that we can then build upon. Unfortunately, in the real world, we don't have that. At least, as yet, we don't have any explanation that's non-natural. I think that there are reasons why we probably wouldn't get one, mainly because these are phenomena that we are observing occurring in the natural world. They're occurring, obviously, thereby under natural laws, and again, thereby on natural material. We would assume that the explanation will fit within that framework and will be described mechanistically, naturally, through, like I said earlier, mathematical frameworks that we can test for and confirm. The big thing here is that that's the only precedent we have for explanations. is ones that which we can quantify mathematically utilizing scientific methodologies, ones that have a precedent for actually working, and we just don't have that for things that are supernatural. Another problem with the supernatural is that with positing supernatural explanations, that aside from the fact that they're really not explanations, and this would be why, is that they don't have any real explanatory power. Where one posits that a god did something, or a ghost opened that door, I could just as easily posit that it was fairies, and my explanation is no more or less explanatory than yours is. This is because there isn't really any real explanatory power in either instance to begin with, mainly, again, because there isn't any mechanistic operation that allows for this entity to interact. If you're going to posit that something is an explanation, you need to be able to define the mechanism by which this entity interacts to produce an effect. And that is the big problem with non-natural, assertions more than explanations, is that they don't have a mechanism for how it can explain this. What is being done that in turn produces the effect? You'll often get, well, we don't know, but we have indications that it's non-natural. No, you really don't if the mechanism that you're positing isn't really a mechanism. There are numerous issues with non-natural explanations being posited. There are no problems with positing natural explanations because, to reiterate, they can be quantified mathematically utilizing scientific methodologies, and there is a very well-established precedent for them. So hopefully now, you guys understand why naturalism or materialism of the gaps just isn't really a cogent response, and why it fails to put natural or material explanations that fit within scientific frameworks on the same footing as God of the gaps. It just doesn't work. If you ever hear somebody posit, well, that's just naturalism of the gaps, feel free to send them to this video. Hopefully, after watching it, they can understand that while this doesn't mean that non-natural things don't exist, we at least have no precedent for them explaining anything in reality. Be sure to share this video with anybody you might be interested in it, and as always, hit the subscribe button so that we can expand the Lion's Den and make this community larger. And until next time, per causam nos perfectum.